Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Hello, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Money Follows the Person and LTSS Rebalancing, Opportunities for States. My name is Sid Pickern. I am a white person with pink and brown hair, red glasses, and I'm wearing a black button-down shirt with red detailing. And I work with the Community Living Policy Center here at the Lurie Institute for Disability Policy at Brandeis University, where we conduct research and advance policy to improve access to Medicaid, home and community-based services for disabled people and older adults. And before we dive in, again, if folks are comfortable sharing in the chat, where you're joining us from. We'd love to hear from you while I go over some information about accessibility and logistics. Next slide, please. So first we have American Sign Language interpreters available. To view the interpreters, click on the interpretation button that looks like a globe at the bottom of your screen, and a small menu will appear. Click American Sign Language in that menu. The ASL interpreters will appear in an independent window that you can move around your screen. We also have closed captions available. To turn captions on, click the CC button at the bottom of your screen. And please use the chat to let us know if you have any accessibility issues or concerns. We will be sending a few resources through the chat towards the end of the webinar, and we will also send any of those resources that we share along with the webinar recording after the webinar. Next slide, please. We do have the Q&A function available for you to ask questions. So to ask or submit a question, click the button with the two speech bubbles that says Q&A on your screen. We will also answer questions through the Q&A function, and we will have some time at the end of the webinar to answer some questions live. Next slide, please. So the Community Living Policy Center and the contents of this presentation were developed under a grant from the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living and Rehabilitation Research, or NIDLR. And NIDLR is a center within the Administration for Community Living at the Department of Health and Human Services, and the content in this webinar is the responsibility of the authors and does not necessarily represent that of those agencies. Next slide, please. So before we jump in, I'd like to just level set for a second and say that the Money Follows the Person demonstration supports states to transition people residing in nursing homes and other institutional settings back to the community. It assists states with rebalancing their long-term services and supports, or LTSS systems, which means shifting services from institutional settings towards home and community-based services, which helps not only to improve autonomy and choice for people with disabilities and older adults, as well as community living outcomes while promoting cost-effective care. So today's agenda looks like we're going to have some MFP history from grassroots advocacy to federal policy. We will get into a state of the states, and we will also hear from Washington with their MFP example. We will hear about the tribal MFP initiatives, and at the end, we'll do a looking forward and we'll have an opportunity for Q&A. Next slide, please. So we feel really fortunate to have our four panelists with us today. We'll be hearing from Henry Claypool, Lurie Institute visiting scholar and independent consultant, Natalie Keene, Director of Federal Health Advocacy at Justice and Aging, Julie Cope, MFP Project Director, Washington State Department of Social and Health Services, and Wayne Soames, Tribal Collective Team Lead, Minnesota Department of Human Services. And now I will hand it over to my colleague and historian, Henry Claypool, to kick us off. Next slide, please. Oh, Henry, I think you're muted. Yep.
There we go. First of all, Henry Claypool. I work with the Brandeis Community Living Policy Center at the Lurie Institute. And I am an middle-aged white male with brown and gray hair, wearing glasses, and I have a kind of blue blazer on and a blue sweater today, trying to stay warm in Arlington, Virginia. And with that, I wanted to just launch into a little bit of history, I guess, and root MFP and its origins. And so the next slide would be great. Just by background, I highlight ADAPT in this because they were largely one of the most strategic advocacy organizations working with the disability rights community. By way of background, they started in the late 70s and early 80s working on public transportation. The T in ADAPT originally stood for transportation. And as they got closer to passing the ADA and the transportation provisions incorporated the changes to allow wheelchair users to ride buses, ADAPT was really able to shift its focus to passage of the ADA in 1990, and they played a really significant role in mobilizing people for, at a bare minimum, the crawl up the steps of the Capitol, which is one of the more memorable scenes leading to the passage of the ADA. Again, ADAPT, I will give you more detail on kind of how they're organized in a bit, but I wanted to first talk about how they've been successful because of some of the unique strengths that they have. Many of their members come from local chapters, and these are people that rely on long-term services and supports. They're not a lobbyist. They were making trips to visit policymakers in their state and even coming to Washington, D.C. to educate policymakers about the critical role that Medicaid services could play in this goal of community integration, which came about in the 1999 when the Olmstead decision was handed down by the United States Supreme Court. And that was kind of the rocket fuel that got the rebalancing movement started and certainly led to the MFP demonstration. And so, again, these strengths are the grassroots. These are real people with real stories coming to tell policymakers why it matters for them to be served, in this case, in the community instead of in an institutional setting. And their mantra, of course, was our home, not nursing homes. Next slide, please. So now I just wanted to give you a little bit of the run up to money follows the person. We have the background on ADAPT. They were principal in moving a concept, uh, the Mikasa legislation, which was drafted in the 90s, um, was something that was never enacted, but it had a number of provisions that have come to pass. And we've been able to take parts of Mikasa and put them into uh, work by funding states to do certain things and get federal match that actually were inspired by this Mikasa legislation. So if you ever have a chance to go in the Wayback Machine, Newt Gingrich was the Speaker of the House, and he actually championed and endorsed the legislation. Um, I think the next really pivotal event is the Supreme Court's Olmstead decision. I'm sure everyone's quite familiar with this. It has generated a lot of focus on community living and the need to rebalance the Medicaid programs. And I was actually working at CMS at the time, in the late 90s when this decision was handed down. And ADAPT held demonstrations outside of the headquarters of HHS in Washington and got a meeting with then Secretary Shalala. Um, so in those meetings, some of the ideas were kicked around, and uh, Mikasa was looked to for kind of could it inform any of the options that we had? And one of the provisions that came out of it was they were called Real Choice Systems Change Grants, I believe, in Mikasa. And this provision was kind of replicated by HHS in an appropriations bill. So we started giving money to states to do a range of activities, these real choice systems change oriented things, which ultimately were focused on the concept of nursing home transition. Nursing home transition had been funded um, by HHS before MFP and just kind of labeled as nursing home transition. You'll notice that these slides, if you can see them, they have color coding. And I'm doing that to draw attention to the bipartisan nature of the creation of rebalancing and the broader kind of community living portfolio, which includes the MFP demonstration. So it was a Republican House that embraced the legislation. It was a Democrat administration in the late 90s that initially got these grant programs started. And then there was a big transition. The Bush administration came to town, and they had a number of priorities. And one was adding prescription drugs to the Medicare program. And the Medicaid program didn't receive a great deal of attention from the administrator in the initial years of the 2000s because um, they were focused on creating this drug benefit in Medicare. Um, the all the while, there was a Bush administration New Freedom Initiative that was funding grants to states. So this concept had taken root and now was being championed by a Republican administration after initially receiving funding in a Democratic administration. So I think we can get a sense for the bipartisan nature of rebalancing, of nursing home transition and ultimately the money follows the person demonstration. Next slide, please. So now we move to kind of this era of continuing grants around systems change. The nursing home transition projects were beginning to mature, and ADAPT's chapter in Texas was inspired by some legislation in the state that allowed the money to move from the nursing home side of the budget to the waiver side of the budget, to the HCBS waiver side of the budget. And that's how it got the name Money Follows the Person. In Texas, it was labeled like Rider 77. It didn't have a fancier name at the time. Um, but as advocates continued to work with that and advocate for that approach of making sure that if you were going to move an individual from an institutional to a community-based setting, that part of the budget should also make the move with the individual so that you continue to grow the capacity of the community-based side and perhaps hold stable nursing home spending in the budget. And indeed, that kind of looks like some of what happens in states as this demonstration has run its course. So Mark McClellan was in the White House in 2000, and ADAPT met him when he was working for the president. He went on to become the Food and Drug Administrator at HHS, overseeing prescription drug coverage and, or not coverage, but safety, I should say. And he later was appointed CMS administrator after the prescription drug benefit was implemented, or the legislation was passed. Mark McClellan then went in and became the CMS administrator, and ADAPT was continuing to protest outside of HHS and meet with officials from the department. And they met with Mark McClellan and I think used the Texas kind of model to fashion the Money Follows the Person demo, or used it as the inspiration for that. And it was finally included in the Deficit Reduction Act of 2005, which was passed by a Republican House and a Republican Senate and signed by a Republican president. So it was fully embraced by the Republicans at that time, and it's something that we can talk about later in the presentation about what we might be able to do going forward around MFP. And as you know, many of the advocates in this system are continue to do the work in their states. With that, I get the pleasure of handing it off to Natalie.
Thanks, Henry, and hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm happy to be talking about the Money Follows the Person program, especially because it has enjoyed such bipartisan support, as Henry was describing. And so, it's something that I've been advocating on for years since entering this work, and I'm hoping that will continue. So I am the Director of Federal Health Advocacy at Justice and Aging. I'm a white 42-year-old woman with brown hair and glasses, and I'm wearing a pinkish purplish sweater today. I'm located in Alexandria, Virginia, so also trying to stay warm like Henry. Um, so I'm going to provide an overview of how MFP works, some data, and more about its impact. So next slide. So Money Follows the Person currently operates in 40 states and territories. Um, It's not the only means of transition services in Medicaid programs. So it's important to note that. Henry talked about, transition services predating MFP, and those services continue in many states outside of MFP. But the MFP program has some unique features. There are 4 target populations that states can choose to focus on in this program. Those are older adults, people with physical disabilities, people with intellectual or developmental disabilities, and people with mental health or substance use disorders. A small percentage of MFP participants may have other types of disabilities or conditions, such as traumatic brain injury or HIV/AIDS. MFP provides services prior to transition and HCBS for 1 year in the community after transition. And to be eligible, a participant in the MFP program must be a Medicaid enrollee residing in an inpatient facility for 60 consecutive days or more. An inpatient facility includes hospitals, nursing facilities, as well as intermediate care facilities for individuals with intellectual disabilities. Participants must move to a qualified residence in the community. So these include homes or apartments that are either owned or leased by the participant themselves or their family member. They also can include small group homes of no more than 4 unrelated individuals. Next slide. So again, as Henry mentioned, this program was created and developed with bipartisan support and has continued to have bipartisan support, including for some extensions and expansions. So it was first authorized in 2005 and has been extended numerous times, first through the Affordable Care Act and then in many health extenders packages since. The current authorization of MFP ends in September of 2027, so less than 2 years from now. The reason it's September is because that's the end of the federal fiscal year. Some expansions that have been made to the program since it started. In 2021, Congress expanded eligibility by reducing the minimum institutional stay from 90 days to 60 days, and also allowed stays in short-term rehab facilities to count. And then in 2022, again, with new funding from Congress, 5 new states and territories took up MFP for the first time. That same year, supplemental services that are not otherwise covered by Medicaid were expanded, and states can now receive 100% federal funding for those services. Examples of supplemental services that can be provided through MFP are short-term rent, utility assistance, food assistance, home and vehicle modifications, and pre-transition services. Next slide. So this program has been really, really successful on both the individual level and systems level. I want to start with a story to illustrate the individual impact. This story comes from our California partners, the California Community Transitions Program. They told us about Maria, who was age 80 when she was admitted to a nursing facility in Concord, California, after a stroke. She was unable to be discharged from the facility because she did not have the necessary resources and support to return home. After 6 months, her public housing benefits were discontinued, and Maria was told that her rent would return to the market rate. This left her facing almost a $9,000 bill and an eviction notice. Thankfully, the MFP team got involved and they were able to pay off the rent bill and coordinate charities to assist. So MFP helped Maria return to her apartment with home and community-based services in place. And now she is thriving in the community, getting to know new people, and reacquainting herself with friends she previously knew. Next slide. So MFPs, again, the program has been very successful on an individual and systemic level. Looking at the systems level, a lot of states and territories have taken up the program. In total, 45 states and Washington, D.C. have operated MFP programs. Puerto Rico and American Samoa now have planning grants for MFP. And you'll hear more later about the MFP Tribal Initiative in 5 states. Since 2008, when the first MFP transitions took place, over 127,000 people have transitioned to community living through the program. These transitions have increased a lot in recent years, and I'll talk more about this later, but it's because there was again some continuity of federal funding. So between 2020 and 2023, transitions increased by 77%. Individuals who return to the community report having greater life satisfaction, being more likely to be treated with respect by their providers, and have less unmet personal assistance needs. Also, again, on the systems level, states with high MFP transitions have been shown to have reduced nursing facility use and expenditures. Next slide. So looking at 2023 data, which is the most recent data we have on a national level for MFP, over 8,000 people transitioned to community living in that year. That was an increase of 29% from 2022. More than 50% of those transitions were older adults. 31% were people with physical disabilities, 11% were people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, 3% were people with mental health and substance use disorders, and 3% had other conditions. But there is, like all things with Medicaid, significant variation by state. So Washington, which you'll hear more about next, transitioned over 1,600 people in 2023, and that accounts for 20% of all transitions nationwide. On the other end of the spectrum, 11 states reported less than 50 transitions. This data, and very important reminder, reflects only the MFP funded transitions. So you'll hear again about how the program has enabled states to build infrastructure that supports other transitions and HCBS capacity overall. Next slide. I want to thank the Community Living Policy Center for this beautiful slide. I love a good map. So it shows us the states shaded in green have active Money Follows the Person programs as of 2025. Those in yellow have planning grants, and the states shaded in red do not currently have an MFP program. And you'll get these slides after the presentation so you can see where your state lands. Next slide. So despite all the success of this program, MFP is still treated as a demonstration and it's not permanently funded. So Congress has to reauthorize it. This, unfortunately, has led to funding gaps and even just some of the short-term extensions that have been authorized can lead to disruption and closure of programs. And so the data we have on where states are with their MFP programs shows the impact of not having this program made permanent. So 6 states ended their MFP programs in 2020 and 2021 when there was a gap in funding. 3 states closed and restarted their programs in 2022 when funding was renewed on a multi-year basis. And then 2 states paused transitions and then reactivated their programs also in 2022 with the renewed funding. Next slide. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this overall HCBS and enrollment, HCBS enrollment and expenditure data, but it's just helpful to put in context, again, this idea of rebalancing. These transitions and investments in HCBS relate to overall HCBS enrollment. So nationwide, 8.4 million people received HCBS in 2023, representing about 87% of all people receiving Medicaid long-term services and supports. That percentage differs quite a bit by age, type of disability, whether someone is also eligible for Medicare, whether someone lives in a rural or urban area, and race and ethnicity. The other measure we use is spending. There's been a lot of progress, thanks to programs like MFP, to shift more spending towards HCBS, but there is still room to improve. So 64% of spending of Medicaid long-term care spending was on HCBS in 2023. But again, that differs depending on the population we're looking at. So for older adults age 65 and older, the spending on HCBS that same year was only 46.7%. For rural communities, it was only 52.7%. And for people with mental health and substance use disorder, 54.4%. Next slide. Another map of states in terms of the ratio of people receiving HCBS compared to institutional services. This data is not perfect, but it helps us see the opportunity to expand programs like MFP. So in 2023, the ratio of people who received HCBS compared to all LTSS ranged from 55.8% in Kentucky to 99.4% in Oregon. The darker green on this map is a higher ratio, so more people receiving HCBS. Next slide. These are a few resources from Justice and Aging. We have a fact sheet handout that you can use with your policymakers to make the case that MFP should be made permanent. We also have resources on the budget bill passed last summer that makes historic cuts to Medicaid and what that means for HCBS and access to health and long-term care for older adults, as well as some other Medicaid resources. So now I am going to hand it over to Julie.
Hello, friends. My name is Julie Cope. I'm a Hispanic brunette wearing glasses. I'm wearing a red sweater and the headset. I am a lifelong Washington resident and work with the state's Department of Social and Health Services, specifically in the Home and Community Living Administration. I am the Money Follows the Person project director for the state of Washington and have been in this role since 2022. Prior to that, though, I have been involved with our state's Money Follows the Person program. I did the data and quality analysis work before this project director position. I was a frontline case manager supporting folks in their transition planning out of nursing facilities. And before that, I was even worked in the private sector as a nursing facility social worker. So I've been able to kind of experience all sides of the nursing facility transition experience. In Washington, our Money Follows the Person program is called Roads to Community Living. And you may notice our logo, our Roads to Community Living logo on several of the subsequent slides. Next slide, please. So Washington is one of 5 participating states with a tribal initiative. And regarding moving individuals out of institutional settings, we have 4 focus populations within our Money Follows the Person demonstration. We work with older adults, we work with adults with physical disabilities, we work with individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and we work with individuals with behavioral health support needs. Our state was one of the first states to participate in the Money Follows the Person program. And our first transition was in early 2008. Over the years, we have leveraged some of the MFP enhanced match, administrative funding, to look at existing data sources for those that are institutionalized, as well as creating our own reports and metrics for Washingtonians who are residing in institutional settings. This was really helpful for us in identifying and then being able to have some focused outreach to these institutional settings for MFP participation. What you're seeing on the screen here is a chart that represents the last 10 years of our MFP transitions, and you can see how the overall increase in MFP transitions happened year over year, with, of course, the notable exception of 2019, 2020, and 2021. In Washington, we were kind of rolling back our MFP program in 2018, believing that we would need to wind down the program. But then, of course, it was renewed. And I don't think I need to remind this group what happened in 2020, where it took us a few years to kind of bounce back to our new normal, if you will, in the long-term services and supports space. With that being said, in 2025, a fantastic banner year, really, for our overall money follows the person transition work. 90% of our MFP transitions are coming out of nursing facility settings. And so in the subsequent slides, we're going to talk a little bit about how MFP has really informed some of our strategies out of the nursing facility and into home and community-based settings. Next slide, please. So here's a little map of Washington, just to kind of orient you to the lay of the land here in our lovely state. You'll notice right away that it's split up into 3 geographical regions. Some elements that might be important to share about Washington's LTSS landscape is that we are a fee-for-service. We have a fee-for-service model for long-term services and supports and home and community-based services. As mentioned earlier, we are a participating state with the MFP Tribal Initiative, and we are working with 29 federally recognized tribal sovereign nations. We have approximately 200 Medicaid certified nursing facilities statewide, and the details of where they're located in each region is kind of listed here on the slide, with the majority of our nursing facilities in our most populous or populated area of the state. And for those who are sports fans, yes, Seattle is in that green section. That is our most populated area. Go Seahawks. And though most of our money follows the person transitions are out of nursing facilities, we also do support transitions out of about 50 acute care hospitals, 10 state or Medicaid certified psychiatric hospitals, and 4 residential habilitation centers, which serves our IDD population. All right, next slide, please. So this is just this last year, 2025, and our monthly nursing facility transitions. This chart denotes that we're doing quite a few transitions out of nursing facilities. The darker section at the bottom of this chart is our MFP transition work. And you can see how when MFP transitions increase, our overall nursing facility transitions increase. Over the past year, we've seen some pretty steady growth overall with MFP, and a special shout out to our staff here. October of 2025 marks the highest MFP transition month since we've rolled out the program, and the highest nursing facility transitions to home and community-based settings since the program went live. The end. So October was an exceptional month here in Washington State. How we looked at money follows the person to kind of refine or enhance our infrastructure outside of just the reports and the data elements to help us kind of focus on where individuals are and who we should connect with. We also invested in our staff. We have dedicated staff who are assigned to each one of our Medicaid certified nursing facilities. And we have found that this dedicated kind of nursing facility transition expertise, if you will, has really played a key role in our overall approach to transition work. We started that we refer to them as nursing facility case managers, and we started to specialize that case management back in 2010. And so these staff are folks who are on site in nursing facilities on a regular basis, at least weekly, connecting with the Medicaid population on the regular. They're completing functional assessments and supporting transition centers or transitions from these centers, partnering with facility staff, instead of what we our model beforehand, which was kind of a mixed caseload. People were just going all over the state to meet with people as they came in instead of requesting services, instead of focusing on a particular setting and working with those individuals and creating and strengthening relationships with the nursing facility staff. This focused outreach has really kind of helped us to engage on an earlier basis in the individual's institutional stay. And we were able to kind of provide education not only to the service recipient, but also to our nursing facilities as well about how we can support folks safely and well in community settings. And as you likely expect, most individuals really prefer to receive services outside of a nursing facility setting. And so our staff are supporting folks on their journey home, wherever that is. Next slide, please. One of the questions Washington receives pretty regularly is, what is the cost of a transition? And so we're just now finalizing 2025 data, but for 2024, this is what it looked like in Washington State. We found that we were able to support folks with as little as $10 to get out of the nursing facility. And in some cases where they were requiring things like a ramp or some other kind of environmental modification to support a return to their home or their preference, the preference and setting, we spent up to almost $50,000. But on average, the average cost to transition someone out of an institutional setting and into home and community-based settings was a little over $8,000. And when you think about what the cost of care is in a nursing facility in Washington, that tends to range right around $12,000 a month. You can see how, though there may be a front-loaded cost, we offset overall expenses of service delivery in a much more meaningful way when folks are transitioning out of nursing facilities and into home and community-based settings. We make up those savings in just a few months. Next slide, please. The last thing I wanted to mention is that Money Follows the Person has really allowed Washington to try out and kind of innovate some new services. We have a lot of regular feedback loops with both our external partners, like our nursing facilities, nursing facility associations, and of course our staff and the service participants who are telling us what would be helpful in these transitions or in keeping people in the community. I listed three services here because these are our newest services that we rolled out. The first is called Technology Support, Consultation, and Technical Assistance. This is a service where an assistive technology professional will meet with the client, meet with their caregivers, and meet them in their environment to make some recommendations about what kind of assistive devices or assistive technology will be helpful for that individual. They will look at what type of devices the individual maybe already is accessing in attempts to try to leverage and maximize the functionality of those particular devices and how they might work with other devices. This was exceptionally or helpful because our staff and, of course, our residents, our participants aren't technology experts, right? So it was great to be able to have a professional provide recommendations, and then those things could be incorporated in a person-centered care plan. The other is a smart care device. We actually looked to another MFP state in New York to look at some ways that New York was supporting individuals with ADL reminders, cues, but also something that was interactive and replaced like human assistance. And that was the smart care device. The picture here is an LAQ. And both of these services, both the technology support consultation and technical assistance and the smart care device, we were so successful with these services that we were able to roll them into our state plan, 1915K, our community first choice plan, just earlier this month, so at the beginning of the calendar year. The last thing that we rolled out in this in recent years is we started leveraging Amazon Business and their Amazon's network to be able to deliver essential household goods and even pantry stocking items directly to individuals' homes. Our state we have a lot of rural communities, and so being able to have quick delivery to our participants was of essential goods and service items, excuse me, was particularly helpful. And we are looking to expand this for folks outside of just our Money Follows the Person program. So the last slide, is just my contact information. I know I rapidly went through this, and I'm sure states and other folks may have a lot of questions about how did we get there? You know, we only had so many minutes to talk through it, but I am happy to connect with folks. Feel free to email me, reach out, and we can talk more about our process if that would be helpful for you to learn more. Thank you.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Wayne Soames. I'm the Tribal Collective Team Lead with the Minnesota Department of Human Services. And today I'll be talking about the Money Follows the Person Tribal Initiative here in Minnesota. I'm a person of mixed ancestry. I'm an Ojibwe man with white skin. I have long brown dark hair, brown eyes, a brown beard, and today I am wearing a blue button-up shirt with a white undershirt. And I just want to take a minute or a second before I get into my introduction to introduce myself in my native language as protocol for Ojibwe people. So Bujun Dinaway Magana Dog means so is our Benes indigenous Kanagu. Magazine do de bauting and doing Jaba Nungama special Gawa Bob Kaganda. So I am called Yellow Thunderbird. I am of the Eagle Clan. I come from a place called Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, and today I live near the White Earth Reservation in northern Minnesota. Next slide, please. So as I get started, this project is supported by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services as part of a financial assistance award, 100% funded by CMS and HHS. The contents of those of the authors do not necessarily represent the official views of nor an endorsement by CMS or the U.S. government. Next slide, please. So as it was, mentioned earlier by Natalie and Julie, so there are 5 states who implement the Money Follows the Person program. And as I get started here, I just want to talk briefly about tribal sovereignty, self-determination, and government-to-government relationships. And so those 5 states that implement the Money Follows the Person Tribal Initiative, those are Minnesota, Wisconsin, Oklahoma, Washington, and North Dakota. As a 5-state group, we recognize and respect the government-to-government relationships. And, that theme is going to go throughout my presentation. We recognize tribal sovereignty and self-determination. And as we work with tribes, we really take the lead from the tribes. They understand their people, they understand their barriers, they understand what's needed in their communities. We really take in their guidance and what they need, what those barriers are, and support them and guide them in overcoming those barriers. Tribal nations, there's been many parties who have affirmed tribal sovereignty, but really tribal nations have been governing themselves since the beginning, since their beginning. And there are 3 Supreme Court cases that came about in the early 19th century that really affirmed tribal sovereignty in the modern age, and we're going to look at those. Next slide, please. And so those are those 3 Supreme Court cases affirming tribal sovereignty are called the Marshall Trilogy after Chief Justice Marshall, and I just have a quick quote from him here. Indian nations had always been considered as distinct, independent political communities, retaining their original natural rights as the undisputed possessors of the soil. The very term nation, so generally applied to them, means a people distinct from others. And once again, those court cases were named after Chief Justice Marshall here. Next slide, please. So what is tribal sovereignty? It really refers to the legal recognition of sovereign American Indian nations in the United States. And it establishes that tribal nations have the inherent right to govern themselves. And this wasn't something created from the treaties, that took place throughout the 1800s, but they've always had that right? And this was really affirmed in the early 19th century with the Marshall Trilogy, which was a set of 3 Supreme Court decisions. So those 3 were the Johnson versus McIntosh in 1823, holding that private citizens cannot purchase lands from Native Americans. Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, which held the Cherokee Nation dependent with the relationship to the United States, like that of a ward to its guardian. And then Worcester versus Georgia, which laid out the relationship between tribes and the state and federal governments, stating that the federal government was the sole authority to deal with Indian nations. And so, even though these exist, this was 200 years ago, tribal sovereignty is still a complex idea, something that we need a lot more education on, especially when it comes to Medicaid, waiver, HCBS services, and how do we support tribal sovereignty while also recognizing those policies, everything kind of required of those systems. Tribal sovereignty also consists of our ways of knowing, our ways of being, our spiritual ways, our legal systems, our political structures, and also our culture and language, right? And how that shows up in the services that we want to provide, tribal nations want to provide. So with that kind of little background on tribal sovereignty, we're going to get into Money Follows the Person Tribal Initiative. Next slide, please. So the Money Follows the Person Tribal Initiative is a special initiative under the Money Follows the Person Rebalancing Demonstration Project that focuses on aiding tribal nations and bringing elders and relatives back to their communities by creating more home and community-based services and advocating for the elimination of barriers often associated with state law, Medicaid plans, and state budgets that have made Medicaid funds difficult to use. The Money Follows the Person Tribal Initiative works alongside the sovereign tribal nations in each of the 5 demonstration states to promote long-term services and supports that address health disparities across the lifespan. As a 5-state group, we recognize the government-to-government relationship that's inherent in building relationships with the tribal nations in our states. And what's been incredible about this process is that while it's a federal grant, federally executed at state level, The tribal nations are our guides, and they tell us what they need through the utilization of the grant. And that's where that collaboration, that relationship, that tribal sovereignty and self-determination, they're helping us guide the work. Additionally, the power of the 5 states working towards similar goals has resulted in a national advocacy effort. So you can see there, once again, the 5 states, and if you could go to the next slide, please. These are the 5 Money Falls Person Tribal Initiative states, and you can see the with Washington there. These are the numbers of the enrolled tribal nations in the program. So in there, Washington with 8, North Dakota with 3, Oklahoma with 18, Wisconsin with 11, and then Minnesota with 8. And these numbers as tribes build capacity, bringing in new tribes to the program, supporting tribes as they are doing more work within this realm. Next slide, please. Right now, to talk specifically about Minnesota and what we're doing in Minnesota with Money Follows the Person. So in Minnesota, we have a team called the Tribal Collective, and we are housed within the Minnesota Department of Human Services, more particularly in the Aging and Disability Services Administration. And like on the previous slide, of Minnesota's 11 federally recognized tribes, we currently have 8 participating in MFPTI. The Tribal Collective, it's a team of 4 regional specialists who you can see the regions on the map there are separated into the 4 separate regions. We came on as a team in May of 2024. Back then, there were only 5 tribal nations in the Money Follows the Person Tribal Initiative program here in Minnesota. There was 1 person doing the work spread across all 11 tribes. But since then, we've been able to bring on 3 more, working on to bring on the rest of the tribal nations. And it's great being in this this regional work because our tribal regional specialists they're in the communities that are being served. They're with the people, and they live amongst the tribes, and we're all federally recognized members. And it's really great work being in the communities and building those relationships. And we'll talk more about that too. Next slide, please. So yeah, the Tribal Collective, it exists to strengthen relationships with tribal nations so that tribes are respected as government entities. Tribal leaders are included in decision making, and then Native people have services that honor their cultures. I've been in conversation with some of our tribal nations who talk about sometimes culture, that cultural aspect. It's almost a wraparound service in those plans, right? In those plans for folks receiving services, right? That culture, tribes are embedding culture in those plans, and we really, with this work, we really focus on the relationship and once again that tribal sovereignty. And then 2, nothing about us without us. So when there's decisions being made, we want tribal voices, and that's part of that, correcting injustices and colonization to support American Indians. When there's decisions that are being made about tribal peoples, we want tribal peoples to have a voice in those decisions. Next slide, please. Once again, we're embedded in the communities we serve. We share that power with tribal nations through collaboration, those government to relationships as we co-create policy, collaborate. We really strive to change the systems so tribal nations are centered in the work. And then once again, like our team, we actively practice American Indian traditions. We're in the community with the people, and we really focus on that relationship and being amongst the community. That relationship with work with tribal nations, that's kind of the foundation of everything. Having that strong relationship, we're really a good entry point for tribal peoples into state systems and governments and things like that. And next slide, please. So what we do, just once again, we really focus on that relationship. that community engagement, where we meet with our tribal nations once a month to provide updates, get updates from them. We provide training and technical assistance when it comes to their grants. If there's any grants that come about through other business areas within the state, we share those opportunities with them as well. More internally, we give presentations and we host trainings within the state to help deepen the understanding of the tribal collective and how we can be utilized to support other business areas within state government to support tribes. And then once again, we just provide that TA within our own division and across the HCBS to help strengthen those relationships and strengthen understanding of connecting with tribal nations. Next slide, please. So what we also do, we focus on system changes, creating avenues for tribes to take on more programming, honor their tribal sovereignty, exercise their tribal sovereignty, and then also we do a lot of that grant administration of what they're utilizing the funds for. And then also we have opportunities with the Money Follows the Person Tribal Initiative that we braid additional funding within the MFPTI contract. Tribal nations, folks working there, they often wear several different hats, like many people, but they're spread thin. So one person does 3-4 different jobs. So braiding 3 different funding opportunities in the Money Follows the Person contract really lessens the load. They have one contact person, one review, one report. So, administering that grant administration, braiding funding within the state and other business areas to help support tribal nations. Next slide, please. So what we're going to talk about now is what our tribal nations are doing, and looking at time, I won't go through all of this, but we have one tribe developing a healing center that will be utilized by 3 other tribes where home community-based services will be implemented. Tribes are developing billable services to build capacity for their services. We had a tribe establish a elder tiny home village across the reservations with the construction of 22 tiny homes for elders. And some of that braided funding I mentioned went into that with furnishing and help getting this going. One tribe is establishing an assisted living facility on reservation, bringing people back home who are off reservation several hours. And then 2, there's a lot of work going on. There is a large urban Indian population. So pursuing options to provide services for those folks in the metro area and what that would look like. Next slide, please. Also part of our team, which is really unique and really cool, we have a tribal vulnerable adult and developmental disability targeted case management specialist. So he came on board in 2025, and between May of 2025 and September of 2025, he was meeting weekly with the tribal nations, 8 of the 11 of them, to build out a tribal VAD TCM MA benefit. So taking input directly from the tribes, building that into the plan. Once again, nothing about us without us. And so really getting that tribal input in the development of this benefit. Right now, that's currently still being worked on for the 2026 legislative proposals, but just a really great example of that tribal inclusion. Next slide, please. Emerging themes that we've identified in the last year here. So looking for a pathway for guidance for tribes if they want to do assessments, case management, if they want to take on some of those duties from the counties who currently do a lot of that. Once again, co-designing programming, really working with the tribes collaboratively for that. And then, educational opportunities within state government, understanding tribal sovereignty and what that looks like, and then overlapping themes from internal ads and needs assessments. Recently, we utilized a needs assessment within the Aged and Disability Services Administration kind of redoing that and where themes are, where we need to do more work in connecting with tribal nations. Next slide, please. And this is my final slide here. So priorities going forward for Minnesota Money Follows the Person Tribal Initiative. We're currently working on joint powers agreements for the tribes rather than having that grantor to grantee relationship, looking at something more government to government on an equal footing, really exercising that tribal sovereignty. Once again, we utilize an ads and needs assessment, kind of analyzing that and integrating it into our strategic plan for 2026. And then finally, just touching on again that tribal DADD, developing that with direct input from our tribal nations to submit to the legislative in this year. So that's all I have. Miigwech. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Wayne. So we want to ask all of our speakers if they could please turn on their cameras, and we thought we could do a sort of closing round robin. So just to open up to the panelists to share some of their closing thoughts. So Money Follows the Person is a critical source of federal funding for states to rebalance their systems, improve HCBS infrastructure, and advance community living outcomes for individuals. And so what should folks be thinking about looking forward for MFP? This could be lessons learned or possibly recommendations for states or advocates' next steps.
I'd be happy to start off, Sid, just by really encouraging, particularly those in the audience that might be affiliated with an advocacy group or might be inclined to do that kind of policy work, to advocate with their legislators in their home districts about the importance of this program in your state. The more they hear about it in their local offices, the easier it is for the national groups to then attach to that agenda and, put policy behind it and do something like make Money Follows the Person a permanent feature of Medicaid. But it really is going to take working at the state level to some extent and making sure that members of Congress understand the importance of this program and what it's been able to do for real people and for the Medicaid program together.
This is Natalie. I agree with that, Henry. We do need to make the case to Congress that this program needs to be made permanent. It's been successful. We no longer need the demonstration. We need the permanent funding. And especially right now with the cuts to Medicaid that were passed this summer, there's going to be enormous pressure on states to cut what are considered optional services under Medicaid, and home and community-based services are unfortunately optional. So having funding through programs like MFP is more critical than ever. And I also want to encourage state folks on this call, if you're able, we would love to hear from you about your experience with MFP. How has it helped in your state? Are there barriers to implementing it that you would like to see fixed or improvements that could be made? This is all helpful for us in thinking about shaping the future of MFP.
So this is Sid. I think in light of our timing, there is one question in the chat which I think I'd like to especially give Julia opportunity to answer. It's about housing, and I think that we all know how important housing is to the transition process. So, Allie Cannington had asked, in states like Washington with higher transition rates, what roles do state housing departments play in the transitions? What policy and program best practices have you found between the housing and services systems?
So here in Washington, we the MFP project director before me was really invested in creating relationships with our local housing authorities. They are the ones who are most up to date, the experts, right, on resources that are available, affordable housing opportunities that are coming, let alone what is in their communities existing. And we ended up partnering on kind of early on in our MFP trajectory about with a number of housing authorities, and we had earmarked NED vouchers. Um, the piece that MFP, I think, was really helpful in is we funded through administrative funding positions solely dedicated to creating those relationships, building communication pathways between our agency and the housing authorities in the state. And to like, in some cases, because I've been around 1,000 years, I remember some of our housing specialists would literally go sit in community housing authority offices and wait to speak to someone to talk about next steps. It's incredibly competitive. And I want to make it clear, like even with all of that work that MFP has done, and thank goodness we chose to do that early on and to continue to build on that here in Washington. There still isn't enough. There still isn't enough affordable housing, and so we have pivoted a bit differently, where we are expanding our relationships with some of the different housing authorities, with our Department of Commerce, to learn more about who's coming online, what are the resources that are available, or funding streams that are available outside of MFP, and how can we partner in not only supporting landlords or builders with getting these new properties online, but then also making sure that they're filled with people who also have supportive services through our programs, MFP or 1915C, any of our programs. And then we also have really strongly partnered with a number of supportive housing agencies across the state as well, because we have similar goals and missions, right, to serve a very vulnerable population, remain in the community. So, it's not like the perfect answer, but the path to that is connection, communication, relationships, and sometimes active outreach. Like sit in your office until I can get an answer. And even if that answer is no, thank you, not now, it's still an answer instead of just no response. Um, do want to mention too that for our state, I think we were one of the first states who ended up getting a short-term rental assistance service approved by CMS within the kind of newly revamped supplemental services package and definitions that Natalie was going over earlier. Um, Though supplemental services, that 100% match was available in 2022, it took us until 2023 to actually operationalize our short-term rental assistance. And since that time too, we've kind of used our housing team, which originally again was created out of MFP, but has since converted into permanent employees. They're no longer project because our state realized we needed to continue this work. It cannot just be project based. This is foundational to moving people into home and community based settings and giving them choices and options for independent living with supports if that is what they prefer. So I'm not sure if I fully answered the question or just kind of hit parts of it. But this is not a one and done approach for sure. There's a lot of investment in the future and a lot of investment and time in learning what the existing authorizing environment is and looking for trends, expansion, et cetera, in the future.
Thanks so much, Julie. Really appreciate that thoughtful answer. And we wanted to thank you, everyone, for attending the webinar today. Big thank you to our panelists, our interpreters, and to the Lurie comms team behind the scenes, keeping us on course. In the past, in the chat, we've pasted a link to our webinar survey, which will pop up when you close out. If you could fill that out, that would help us out. Please keep in touch with the Lurie Institute and sign up for our newsletter. And please don't hesitate to reach out to the center with additional questions or for resources. Thank you again to everyone. I hope you stay warm out there and stay safe and have a great rest of your day.